Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are currently watching. This is another episode of the Agile Leadership Spotlight, and it's my pleasure to welcome Mike Burrows today. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's awesome you accepted the invitation. I think it's been a while since we met in person, and that's actually, maybe just start talking a little bit about your background, although probably most people who are tuning in live might know you already, but you've got quite an interesting bio, I think you moved from director in a quite large financial institution, then moved across agile or not so agile communities. And I think you were for a while, growing communities and then jumping between communities. So give us a little bit about a background on your original, let's say, start where this whole thing,
Well, I suppose very quickly in terms of the large part of my career. I mean, I'm old enough to have had multiple careers,
right.
which is cool.
But I think having been a manager, and talking about leadership, having been a leader in a large organization, that makes a difference, right?
It makes a massive difference.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start about your
Let's
experiences.
start with that. So, I mean, my background before I was a manager was in development. I did a master's degree, did very technical computing to start with, then got into IT, and that eventually brought me into the city, which I expected to be boring, but I actually really loved it. And I've worked for multiple banks, investment banks and commercial banks for the most part. I was at UBS. Well, I joined Swiss Bank actually in 1997. That merged with UBS, become UBS. As a developer originally, as a contractor to start with, then they enticed me to join as a permie, and got more and more responsibility. And kind of at the peak, I was an executive director managing a global department. That global department was fixed income securities, and that was quite a place to be in 2009. Kind of towards the tail end of the credit crisis.
Exactly.
Was when I left UBS. I won't go too much into the detail of that, but that was one of the most intense times of my whole career, to put it mildly. And then an interesting thing happened. I exchanged jobs with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine at UBS, left UBS to found a startup in the energy risk management space. So energy, different kind of market to finance, but actually the risk management side actually has a lot in common with them. And that's what, what they brought that was special to that domain. He actually came back to UBS, but suggested me as their replacement CTO. That became the case study for my first book, Kanban from the Inside. And if you're wondering why this has this strange picture of an old building on the front cover and the river and all the rest of it, it's actually the Danube in Budapest. I was in Budapest. I did a week in Budapest, a week at home for a year and a half. And that experience was the case study for my first book. Now, what crystallized that book was a blog post I wrote in 2013. New Year's holiday 2013 is when I wrote it, introducing Kanban through its values. So I was very, very much in the Kanban community at the time. Prominent member of the Kanban community. That blog post just exploded. It is still my most popular blog post, and probably will remain so for the rest of my career. And that, the blog post led to the book. One book has led to two others, and eventually probably a fourth one. And I kind of redefined Kanban in terms of a model of 9 values. And I found that gave me so much permission to talk more broadly about things than just talking in terms of practices and principles ever would. And then from values, it was a very simple step to outcomes, which is really what I've dedicated the rest of my career to. So I sort of moved to the side of the Kanban community. I'm not very involved there anymore, to give me the space to do something a bit different, sort of stepping back from frameworks and practices and tools and getting much more into strategy, leadership, things like that. Helping organizations have the kinds of conversations they should be having before they get too seriously into frameworks, into Agile, into Kanban, into Scrum, or whatever it whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I got tired of doing training courses and then finding that half the people in the room didn't know why they were there.
Yeah.
Realizing
Yeah.
there's a lot that's not happening in organizations that really should be happening. And once I found out a way to address that, I found really it was a way also of bringing leadership into it and helping leadership have better conversations about strategy, helping other people have better conversations about strategy as well. So developing the coaching side in leaders and so on. So it's all sort of snowballed from that sort of simple idea. The simple idea, what if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions?
Right.
What if we'd agreed on outcomes before we do the Kanban course?
Yeah.
What if we agreed on outcomes before we do the
Yeah.
Scrum course or the Safe
Yeah.
training or whatever it might be?
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, you're putting everything into much more strategic context, and you're helping people participate in that strategy process, and so on. Big stuff.
That's cool. So this is the whole arc of about 15 years, probably, right, or something
It
like.
is, yeah. So, it's 25 if you start from
Right.
when I joined
Yeah.
UBS.
Right. Sure.
That was
It's more.
97.
Yeah.
So I left UBS in 2009. Yes, so that's 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting. It's been an interesting ride. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to talk about outcomes, leading with outcomes, obviously, a little bit more today, and this question about, what are solutions which come from elsewhere? What are they doing to our organizations? How could we approach them differently? But before we dive a little bit, into the closer history or today's agenda, which by the way is already a topic on its own because you're the founder of Agendashift. It's one important milestone here we want to talk about. What attracted you initially to Kanban? I mean, just to not take it, from the methods point of view, but where did you see benefits or the actual attractors for you and your organizations?
I think a lot of it wasn't so much that it was like a radical alternative. It was more that
Yeah.
actually it really did a lot to explain what did and didn't work in
Right.
most of my past experience.
Right.
And certainly in terms of process problems. And it's not just that it's a particular tool that works very well, when implemented in the right way, in the right context, and all the rest of it. But there's some underlying, almost sort of like mathematical, physical things that underpin it, that explain why it is as powerful as it is. And some other more social things that perhaps are underappreciated as well. So for those of you that don't know Kanban, a lot of what's interesting about Kanban is how we deliberately, explicitly control the amount of work in progress that we have at a time. A very lean idea, and couple that very lean idea with visual management. So it's visual ways of controlling work in progress, and everyone focuses on the performance benefits of doing that, and it's explained in a very mathematical way and so on. But actually, the social benefits, the human benefits, are enormous as well. If you have, for example, as was always the case with every team I've worked with in the last, let's say, 15 years, after a number of weeks or a number of months, the number of pieces of work for a team was always a smaller number than the number of people in the team. Now, that has some implications. That tells you that there are always people collaborating with other people.
Yeah.
And it's that relationship between work in progress and collaboration is the thing that is just like the penny drops, the aha moment that people have when my games Change Ban and Feature Ban are what I used to teach Kanban, or when I was teaching Kanban. And that's the takeaway, that people realize they work it out for themselves. I'm very careful when I'm facilitating those games not to mention the relationship between collaboration and work in progress, and people discover it for themselves, and that's a wonderful moment, a wonderful takeaway from that. Not unique to Kanban. I mean, limiting work in progress and having people collaborate, pretty critical to Scrum as well. Well, when Scrum is working well, if you don't see Scrum as trying to pack as much as you can into a sprint, but actually see about getting, choosing the right goals and the right amount of work that people are going to collaborate around. Different mechanisms, but those underlying principles, the mathematics of it is quite similar.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be agile, you need people collaborating, and if you need people collaborating, You can't all be overwhelmed with ridiculous amount of work. You can't be context switching and all the rest of it. You've actually got to be focused on a small number of pieces of work that make sense in the context of a very small number of overall goals. You've got that, then you've got a chance.
So you mentioned the social bit around this approach of collaborating, and you mentioned agreement already today a couple of times.
Yes.
And, there is this obvious saying that you can't approach a psychological problem with logical, let's say, solutions or attempts. Now, mentioning the math behind, is one thing, but usually, I'm not sure what your experience is. Just think about limiting WIP, right? It could, as logical it might seem from a mathematical formula, I think I'm not just talking about a team, organizations have a hard time just to say, all right, we got it. Now let's just do that.
Quite. Exactly.
What's been your experience then to move further and to say, all right, I already approached this via a totally different, angle. That's where your book came from, Kanban from the inside, and where you came up with the values. What stood out for you then, taking different routes, working with organizations?
I think a lot of it. I mean, a lot of change practitioners will know that, you're always looking for where is there appetite and opportunity.
Right.
Where do the appetite and the opportunity align with each other?
Yeah.
So that you're making changes in the right way that take us towards where it is we want to get to. Now that assumes that you've had the conversations about where you want to get to, what direction you want to go in, what you want to see improve, and so on. And that's why teaching people to have conversations about outcomes is so important. In terms of those Kanban values, that second value, chapter 2 of the book, it's chapter 8 of the book. Chapter 8 of the book, agreement. That's the one that, in the early days when I first published the model, people thought agreement was the weakest of the values. And then slowly people came down to realizing actually it's the most subtle and maybe the most powerful of all the values. Now, in Kanban method terms, the basis for that one was a principle. Begin on the basis of agreement that we'll pursue evolutionary change. Now, I personally don't find that, certainly now, don't find that principle very exciting. I think I don't get excited about evolutionary change. I think it's like the wrong metaphor for a great tool. And I think Kanban would be a better place if it found a better one. Agreement on outcomes, that really does excite me. And if it's authentic agreement, the right people in the room agreeing on things on their own words, in their own words, where the result of that discussion wasn't prejudged. So it's not just people selling solutions, but people really fundamentally agreeing what it is they want to achieve. Well, that's powerful stuff. And outcomes work at many levels. They can be very high level, aspirations and things around purpose and mission and things like that. They can be at the level of signs that we're succeeding, and they can right down at the down in the weeds in terms of the smallest impacts of the smallest experiments. And you can choose at which level you're going to focus your efforts, and you can calibrate. If you're stuck, then you start small. If you're feeling more confident, more capable, you can reach a bit higher. I think the idea that change should only be in tiny increments. Continuous transformation doesn't mean that your changes are infinitesimally small. To use the mathematical version of continuous, it's just that they're happening all the time. And if you're serious about it, they've got to be with some intent as well. Just fixing problems because you see them doesn't actually meet needs. It doesn't get you to where you want to get to. And if you're going to get to where you want to get to, you need to have a conversation about what that is, what that looks like, what direction that's in. And these are the bits that are so often missing. So many people practicing, inspect and adapt, for example, and there's so little actually guiding that journey. It's just random change, as though people are happy that if we fix something, then that's good enough. Or worse, if we have the opportunity to complain about something every 2 weeks, so that's enough, and it just isn't. No. So agreement on outcomes is actually, and when you realize that these outcomes at different levels, that they relate to each other in different ways, you're actually doing strategy. If you're serious about the outcomes, serious about the obstacles that are in the way in the outcomes, serious about where you're going to focus your efforts, you understand the potential relationships between those outcomes, then you are genuinely doing strategy. You've got a theory for where things are going to take you. You're making decisions about where you're going to commit your effort, and so on. So by teaching people how to have these obstacles and outcomes conversations in the strategic context, and properly organizing the results of those conversations, we are teaching people how to do strategy. Whether that's a day-long workshop,
Yeah.
or it's a drive-by conversation about what it is you're trying to achieve,
Yeah.
and where
Yeah.
you're starting, what your obstacles are, and so on.
So this is an interesting point, because I was just, while you were referring to all these concepts, thinking about OKRs, right? Is a funny new buzzword where I still don't really understand what's so interesting about it, because I think the core idea is super simple. It's super old. I think management by objectives originally was targeting in the same direction, and we all know it's got misused. And I'm not sure if we're on the wrong track by not looking at what's behind, what's needed, what's missing. And so I was just thinking, while there is agreement, a potential lever to get something going. I think understanding, in most circumstances, specifically in larger organizations consisting of boxes and lines between boxes, right?
Yes.
Can be a very urgent and challenging thing before we even talk about agreement. And so for me, the question is, let's talk a little bit of a bigger picture, not saying, well, it's only here locally to talk about a local change, but a bigger thing. There's teams, there's departments, there's programs, and there's leadership, maybe senior leadership. How would you see that we find an opportunity to get closer to each other, to get a sense of what outcome means on the different levels, what the bigger picture of the company is, and so forth?
Yes. So the thing here is that what you need when you're making any kind of change, you're having any kind of strategy conversation, is that it's properly contextualized. So that doesn't mean you need to have a detailed model of the whole universe to make a decision, but you need to know enough about what's outside you that whatever you come up with is going to be a good fit for that context. And if it's a good fit for that context, you stand a chance of making a good impact. Impact on your customers, impact on your bottom line, all those kinds of things. So I don't believe in going overboard about doing lots of current state analysis and things like that. I mean, quite a lot of those exercises are a massive waste of money, in my opinion. You're paying people outside of the organization to do a lot of detailed work, and most people inside the organization will remember, if they're lucky, 1% of that work. So what's much more important is to make sure that any work you do on strategy does involve an appreciation of context. And if you need people to represent that context, stakeholders from outside of your area, in order to do a good job of that, then do that. And it's kind of strategy 3 of, Agendashift I now describe as 3 strategies. The first one is keep asking the agreement on outcomes question. What if we put agreement on outcomes before solutions? The second one is keep outcomes in the foreground. The third one is keep finding new places to do strategy. You choose a scope where you know that people can have a purposeful conversation. Choose an area where either there is an identity, or where that identity needs to be better developed, where there is a purpose, or that purpose could be better developed, and where we could develop strategy better. And if we make sure that context is well represented, that the people inside the context especially are well represented, then you don't necessarily need that big upfront analysis project. And big upfront analysis projects tend to drive big upfront solutions. And they are the problem that I'm trying to address, really. I think the old idea of change management has been choosing solutions and selling them to people, and then living with the consequences. Fine if you're upgrading your email server, not fine if you're trying to do anything cultural, anything complex, anything adaptive. You need to interact with your problem.
Right.
And just choosing a solution up front is the reason why, we're told that, so many of these change initiatives fail. We did
Right.
turn that round. Instead of using outcomes to sell solutions, start with outcomes and use the fact that there's got different granularities to help us find solutions, and not do that until you need to, and make sure it's the right people doing the finding and so on. You're completely turning that change management process on its head. It's a different paradigm.
Right.
Overused word, but it's appropriate here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry for that. I have to admit I just recovered from one of these viruses.
There's a lot of it about her here.
Which is quite unpopular these days,
Yeah.
and probably will remain so. But maybe it's the term change. Is that already a little bit part of the problem?
It is.
Like
Yes.
saying maybe a reframe of the whole story would help.
Yeah. I know we've had this conversation multiple times
Yeah.
over the years, haven't we? About the words like change, words like transformation. The problem, I believe, is too many of the managed change frameworks. They start with the change. Don't start in particular with outcomes. I mean, outcomes is how I frame, my alternative to that. But
Exactly.
starting with the change is the way that many of these things start. Then you're in the process of selling that change, and people have got conned into the idea that resistance to change means that you aren't selling it well enough. To reuse an old joke, change management is like violence. If it's not working, you're not doing it hard enough.
That doesn't sound good.
But actually, maybe resistance to change should be taken as a sign that we're approaching it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I believe that fundamentally. And it doesn't mean we should always be cautious. We shouldn't try anything ambitious.
Yeah.
It means that starting from the point of a change and selling it is completely the wrong place to start. Let's approach it in a way where the right people at the right time will find solutions. So finding solutions is very different from selling solutions.
Right.
You use outcomes as the things that you organize around, and you invite people to organize. Well, first of all, to articulate those outcomes, then to organize around them. That is a completely different proposition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're obviously talking about, not fixing the past, but actually creating a capability for the future, because obviously deviation, if we call it this way, or things where we see other opportunities or where we just see
yes. I mean, for fans of things like solutions focus and liberating structures, I love all that, looking for those teeny tiny signs that something, we might already have the beginnings of a solution already there. If we look at where things are working, where they're working better than elsewhere, 15% solutions, we don't have to always to come up with the definitive solution
that
will deliver the whole thing in one go. If we accept that we are probably going to need to iterate, then a 15% solution, that's enough. And it doesn't take very many 15% solutions to get us a long way.
Yeah, right. I want to point people to your website here, which was one of your earlier ones. I think you basically, developed your whole platform and product and offering further. But Agendashift was a milestone, I think, in your work, where people still find a lot of these pieces you've just been talking about. One of them being the book. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, I have two of them. One book, Agendashift. Oh, here it is, which was just translated into German.
That's the German version you've got there.
Exactly, the German version done by Björn Jensen, a great friend of mine, together with his colleague Jennifer Pfahl. And it's the translation of the latest edition, so highly recommended, because it really gives not only the insight on what you were just talking about, but a lot of hands-on tools, practices, which are obviously relaxed, not like a framework. And the other one, to mention this one, another important piece here, right to left, because that obviously points to outcome first, right?
Yes. Well, right to left is how we keep that second strategy, keep outcomes in the foreground. Right to left means working backwards. If you're a Kanban guy, you'll know, work right. You review your board right to left. You start with the ones that are finished. Are they staying finished? And then the ones that are nearly finished, how do we get them over the line, and so on? And we work backwards, and it's a way of focusing on finishing and not starting more than we have the capacity for, and so on and so on. Now, keeping the focus on outcomes, the way we do it is we work backwards from two critical moments. There's a moment when it's done, And done here means someone's need was met. So
Mm.
done here doesn't mean, code complete, tested. It means someone's need was met, and we're serious about owning solutions until the outcome has been achieved. But that's only done. Really done is when we've captured all the learning from that experience, what we've learned about our customers, our products, our technology, our organization, ourselves, from the process of delivering that. So that focus on getting to done, need met, that's something that's every day. That's in the mindset in the stand-up meeting. It's not about how many lines of code did I write together today. It's how close are we to demonstrating that we've met the need. We know whose need. We know how we'll know we'll be successful. And those kind of questions before we ask about how we're going to achieve it. And then what have we harvested all the learning? That's a question for those sort of longer cadence feedback opportunities. Your reviews of different kinds. But that's how we keep outcomes in the foreground. And it's a way of taking your existing rhythms, meetings, and so on, and tweaking them a bit to make outcomes a lot more prominent and to learn to the max, all the time.
Right.
And it really does change the focus away from outputs, just churning stuff out, to actually meeting needs and learning from the process. And if you're doing anything strategic, you're doing anything creative, you're doing strategy deployment, you're doing product development, you need all of that.
So all of this sounds actually attractive, should sound attractive to every organization. You couldn't say, no, that's nothing we want. The outcome is not relevant for us. And we talked about here. Still, the question to me is, and we've got this big word leadership here, or we said leading with outcome.
Yes.
And I want to pull this a little bit in, because first, I know you are quite in, close to self-organization or approaches around self-organization. At the same time, now let's go back to the big financial institutions and whatever established organizations. What's your experience there? And Agendashift is out there in the field for quite a few years already, to get this going, to get the leadership you actually want to see, which might start with formal leaders, but we know leadership is more.
It's actually very interesting. UBS was actually a surprisingly good example of self-organization at work, and actually good governance at work as well. I mean, it was an early pioneer of beyond budgeting, for example.
Right.
If you look at the history of UBS, it was a merger of the old UBS and Swiss Bank. And Swiss Bank, in turn, got a sort of injection of innovation and of culture from American outfits they bought, O'Connor's and others. A very entrepreneurial spirit, and also a self-organizing spirit as well. I mean, one of the things that helped my career progress at UBS is that I took leading roles in some big, what we called front-to-back projects. And I was a front office guy on the IT side, but front office, trading, and so on. The front-to-back projects were the projects that most of my colleagues ran away from, but I found really interesting. They were the ones that, instead of getting really about the sort of intricacies of things like pricing and market connectivity and those kinds of things, which most of my colleagues specialized in, front-to-back is about our relationship with like middle office, risk management, accounting, finance, with settlements and all those kinds of things. And it's remarkable how big some of those, and even mission critical projects, how little project management support we relied on, and how much instead we relied on teams talking to each other. As you know, but most of our listeners won't know, I'm very interested in these models where self-organizing groups of people, circles, let's call them, where they know what they're responsible for, and they talk to other circles, and between them, they achieve things that neither circle could on their own, with minimum reliance on external support to get it done. That's not to say we didn't have a few, really great project and program managers, but that wasn't how most of our work got done. A lot of the work of project management was actually to do the talking to compliance and to regulators and things like that. that the techies didn't want to do.
Okay.
And you need people with specific expertise to do a good job of those things. Expertise that I certainly don't have. But I'm one of the lucky ones. I've seen agile-ish and self-organized ways of working for most of my career. Long predating the Agile Manifesto. What the Agile Manifesto did was crystallize, people's best experiences and people's best understanding of what's possible. In a way, and I'm celebrating the Agile Manifesto. It was generative. It got people excited. It helped new ideas and so on. I think the Agile community is in perhaps a bit of a mess at the moment, but I celebrate Agile. It's a part of my career. It's a part of the history of software development, particularly product development more generally, and some organizational things as well. I was very clear to pay back my debt to Agile in Right to Left in particular. That's the Digital Leader's Guide to Lean and Agile is the full title of that book.
Right.
I did my best to honor my sources. I mean, and all my books, they're well referenced and everything else. Celebrate these things doesn't always mean copying what other people are doing without understanding how they got there.
But you did a great job in not being, looking again into this book. So again, this is the German version, and there might be other language versions too, but at least the original should be English, right?
Yes.
So for anyone who wants to grab it, I think it's available also as ebook.
And an audiobook. The English Right to Left is the only one I've done as an audiobook. So
if it's an audiobook.
If you stand the sound of my voice,
no, that's beautiful.
As well.
Nice British accent, of course.
Yes.
And how could you resist that? No, but there was one particular chapter I picked out, which was where you wrote about things like, for example, the Spotify model. That was one thing, but even more, the SAFe framework.
Yes.
Which some people, like me, for example, are not particularly in love with. But still, I mean, I can read your, let's say, professional, how can I say, stance of saying, hey, this is not all bullshit just because I don't like it, but there is some truth in everything.
Yes.
And on the other hand side, there is obviously also things to be aware of.
Well, I try to. I mean, there are things. I have some real criticisms of SAFe.
Yeah, and
if you're going to criticize something, criticize the best version of it, not a straw man.
Right.
And so I try to explain, what it's about. I think the principles that it's founded on are actually excellent. And at the very least, SAFe is a coherent assemblage of things. You can at least say this is, in some sense, possible.
Yeah.
And it demonstrates how these different practices work together and so on. My problem with SAFe is the imposition of it. It's the rollout project. If we started with the SAFe principles and asked ourselves, well, which one resonates with us most at the moment? Which one is most going to help us? And chose one. And then said, well, which of the SAFe practices will help us achieve what we want to achieve? And if there isn't one that we like, can we come up with another one, find it from outside or invent our own? Rinse and repeat. That would be not quite agenda shift, but that would be a much more acceptable way of approaching implementation. Instead, SAFe is about training everybody. Clearly, I'm in favour of training. I train as a living, but training everybody in a framework and leaving it to them to worry about what on earth it means for them, and then going through all that pain of rollout. And then living with the consequences of that rollout, which is almost guaranteed not to work out in the way that everybody expected. That is what I object to, and I object to it quite strongly. I think the bigger the thing you are implementing, the worse it gets when you are implementing it in that kind of way.
Right. And that brings me back to this question about leadership, because what we have here now is obviously two extremes, or at least two versions of a possible organization. You talked about your experience, where there was a total different approach for organizing. You mentioned circles, or at least sort of
Yeah, we didn't call them circles at UBS. Now I know the theory. I understand why, and this is why learning theory is good, because you can revisit your experiences and get something fresh out of them.
Yeah. And I think we agree that a circle is somehow more attractive than a pyramid. Somehow
Absolutely.
there is something to the shape.
Yes, I mean, it's not that the hierarchy isn't there.
No.
If you look at the hierarchy edge on, you don't see the hierarchy anymore.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
you can expand it in a different direction and see the circles instead. Yeah.
But this was not about dogmatic exactly. It was more like, hey, there is a purpose behind this, and then there is the other approach where you just put a picture there and say, hey, we need to do that. Because I have no better idea. And we need to overcome certain issues.
Well, yes, I mean, that's being really cynical about it, is choosing a solution because you don't have a clue.
Exactly.
Choosing a solution because you don't actually have a strategy.
Yeah.
What I'm telling people is actually having good strategy conversations is a lot easier than you might think. Now, there are some skills, but they're good skills to learn. They will make you a better leader. So I just don't have a lot of sympathy with the idea that, all our problems will be solved by choosing the right solution and rolling it out.
Right.
And even if you chose the right one or a good one, when has being right ever been enough? You've got to bring people with you. And if you're not careful, you're back in that old, selling mode again, and people will actually resist being sold to. Hey, that's just your theory. That's just an idea. I'm actually quite happy doing what I'm doing. Until you've had the real conversations about what we're trying to achieve, what obstacles are in the way, what frustrates us, all those kinds of things. What challenges do we face? Which do we accept as constraints? Which do we, commit to trying to overcome? All those kind of conversations. You're doing your organization a disservice by embarking on that big rollout.
Yeah. I mean, strategy is an interesting point here. So that seems to be one of the key elements to make a difference. And I wouldn't see that. I mean, at least I can't imagine that large companies, for example, that basically what they call strategy is generally wrong. But couldn't it be that to say, well, but it's missing a lot of more essential bits, what we just been talking about, right? Like I can say, hey, in the next 5 to 10 years, whatever, or 7 years, we need to approach this and that market and this and that direction, blah 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 blah. But hey, isn't that?
UBS actually is a case in point. I mean, you will remember. I mean, particularly based in Central Europe, you will remember that UBS had a particularly bad time in the credit crunch. I mean, it could literally have ceased to exist as a bank, which is shocking for a Swiss bank. Sitting on all those assets and then to find itself so vulnerable. It was a scandal. No, that's the right word to use. I think even the people that reported on it afterwards internally agreed that it should not have happened. And they did the worst possible thing. They set a target. Well, they compounded their problem.
Mm-hmm.
They knew they wanted to be somewhere that they weren't. They paid the consultants to tell them that that's where they wanted to be, what they probably already had decided already. And then they went down that path faster than they had the capability to cope with. Faster than they piled into mortgage-backed securities faster than their risk management capability would keep up.
Mm-hmm.
Because McKinsey had done a benchmarking exercise and told them they weren't doing enough there. That very nearly destroyed a major world-class institution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is a failure. That is a failure of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
There were multiple failures of leadership, and some of the behaviours were genuinely scandalous. I mean, why the Treasury in Zurich was investigating in this junk is beyond me. But these organisations catch on to these ideas. People get excited about them, and when that's happening with the right things, that's good. But when it's on the wrong things, when people aren't realistic about the obstacles, the challenges, the constraints, the risks, all those other things, then you are risking disaster. Really, in this case, really was disaster.
Do you think this is? I mean, we just mentioned leadership, and obviously nobody's here into bashing somehow a specific role. Rather, I think we share a sort of perspective, where we talk about systems, and systems somehow are intertwined in very complex ways. And
Yep.
specifically large organizations, there is, for example, there is a stock market, there is shareholders, and
Yep.
a lot of these things. And do you think that larger organizations literally have a harder time to escape this somehow? What we just talked about, gaps in terms of strategy, predefined versus grounded and elaborated from the bottom or
Yeah.
by invitation.
It may be age as much as size. I mean, there's there's the classic conundrum. What makes you successful is the thing that's hardest to let
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
And that in the end is what makes you vulnerable to things like new entrants and so on. And also, you just establish certain ways of doing things, certain patterns, and so on. And I've mentioned resistance to change already. When it was originally, the term was first coined, and it wasn't about selling solutions. It was recognizing the fact that organizations are set up to work in a particular way, and it's good that they do. That's what holds them together.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the same expectations get reinforced and reinforced and reinforced, and deviations get squashed. Mostly for good reason,
Mm-hmm.
but when you need to change, that starts to be a problem in its own right. And so that's why that keeping outcomes in the foreground strategy is so important. If we are going to not overcome resistance to change, but actually address one of the mechanisms that causes resistance to change, the fact that our feedback systems are looking for certain things and amplifying certain things and dampening certain things down. We need to address that if we're going to change successfully. And that's partly a process and practice thing. It's also a leadership thing as well. Leadership expectations are really important, and leaders often underestimate the influence that they have, and how they carry themselves, how they articulate things can make a big difference on how people approach their work. The kind of solutions they're going to look for, and so on. People don't always understand just how much freedom they have, or freedom that they should have to find good solutions is actually denied them by leaders that are, micromanaging, choosing their solutions for them, and so on. Yep.
We're nearly 3/4 of an hour already into the conversation. I forgot to actually invite because invitation is a thing here. For any questions anybody has, just drop them into the chat. We're still happy to pull them in as a prioritized topic. But before, I was just thinking about it. I had two examples in my mind. One, which is the famous VW scandal about diesel. Gratefully, I think they were lucky. It somehow was revealed and detected. So before the company might have gone bankrupt, if that would have gone further. And another story I just heard about Boeing, which was this terrible disaster about this Boeing Max, I can't remember the exact name, which is now shown as a documentary on.
Both those organizations are so big that they are effectively they're actually national champions, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And
now, in the case of Boeing, would the US government let Boeing go bust?
Yeah.
In the case of VW, would the German government let VW go bust? I think those are actually quite interesting questions.
That's one of these systemic things, right? Where things go further. But this documentary on Netflix, which you can watch now about Boeing, you recognize it started way in the 80s, 90s, when after a merger, the senior executive leadership team decided we need to maximize shareholder value. Everything has to go underneath this, let's say, premise. And that basically started eroding the so famous engineering culture, which was about quality, innovation, everything else. Now, the interesting thing, I want to come back to the more tangible things. Of course, for an executive in this and that position, it's not easy just to say, all right, I don't care about this stock exchange thing and whatever, shareholders. But at least, wouldn't I be better off if I would have installed, and I was taking it this simple way, leadership on all levels? So to say, it's not only about us to take action, but action is happening everywhere. And gratefully, people are taking ownership. And even if it's a small initiative, do you see that happening? Or I can imagine Agendashift and your approaches are even fostering this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I mean the target audience for the Agendashift Academy is leaders in transforming organizations.
Hmm.
And I chose those words very carefully. If by any definition you could see yourself as a leader in a transforming organization, or you aspire to be a leader in a transforming organization, then it's for you.
Hmm.
I'm not aiming at a particular level in the organization, which sounds like a cop-out, but actually I'm very focused on looking at things that scale really well. Outcomes scale really well. You can have outcomes big and small, as I said, outcomes that apply at every level: personal, team of teams, whole organization. Hypotheses, experiments, that's another idea that actually scales really well. Leadership scales really well, and that's what leadership at every level is all about. And those kinds of things scale so much better than process does. And
Yeah.
process first approaches, I think, actually always there's a danger of making things worse rather than making them better, because you have to implement process-based approaches. Whereas these other things that I talked about, obstacles, outcomes, purpose, mission, leadership, all these kinds of things, you're looking to amplify what's there and maybe fill the odd gap. And then you're looking for that the relationship between the levels is healthy as well, because often it isn't. I've mentioned micromanagement already, but often we manage upwards really badly as well. We second guess what people want rather than actually properly exploring, expectations. And a sort of negotiation about expectations and accountabilities and things, those are often very badly done as well.
Mhm.
We're just afraid to have those conversations. But I found when I've had those conversations, they've saved my bacon. I've been asked for something I didn't want to deliver, and then I've asked, well, what kind of whatever that is? And
Mhm.
actually, it was nothing scary at all. We could easily negotiate it to something that made sense to
Right.
everyone. Both sides of that. So if you want to scale, look for things that are self-similar. Same sort of thing happening at every level.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how fractals work. That organizations, it fits very nicely into organizations, and there are ways some naturally work with hierarchies. When you use words like level, people instantly think, it's all about hierarchy. But then you look at, as I said, look at the hierarchy edge on and start to see it in terms of circles and networks and things like that.
Mhm.
That gets
Mhm.
very, very interesting very quickly.
Yeah. So that sounds like a neat, difference between a living organism and just a machine which we're trying to optimize.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't want to miss process at the end potentially, but we start looking at the organism first.
Yes.
It's probably comparable to medicine, right? Where modern medicine took.
Yeah, well, I have some, some personal experience. My daughter
Mm.
has a complex,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
profound and complex condition. Everything affects
Yeah.
everything else, and you
Yeah.
try and fix one thing, and another problem emerges elsewhere. But that's what systems are like, and but they're like that in good ways as well as bad. Systems come together, and only when you see them in operation do you understand what behaviors emerge from that configuration. And all the good things about teams, all the good things about organizations, those
Mm.
are emergent things. You could take the same people and reassemble them somewhere else for a different purpose, and
Mm.
it's not going to perform
Mm.
in the same way. And two organizations in the same domain can still be
Mm.
fundamentally different in how they
Mm.
work. Google and Apple,
Mm.
Microsoft, three examples. Very, very different organizations. They're competing with each other,
Mm.
and
Mm.
yet the way they work is different, in every case. And the thing with systems is how the pieces relate to each other is as important, if not more important, than the individual pieces
Right.
themselves.
Right.
And as leaders, we're paying attention to that, nurturing that, making sure that the conversations are happening that need to happen.
Yeah.
And conversation is absolutely fundamental.
Right.
The philosophy of organization is that they are social constructs.
Exactly.
Without conversation, your organization does not exist.
Right.
It
Right.
is that fundamental.
And I love to add, usually, even a leader, the notion of a leader is a result of a social process, because obviously a leader is not necessarily a manager, right?
Yes.
But just somebody who was, elected to be followed,
Someone
or
who's being followed. Yes, yes,
right.
yes, yeah.
And the question, I mean, adding here the link to your website, where you also give an insight. I think there's a possibility for a self study course to
Yeah, we
dive
do.
quickly into your concept.
Self-paced training. The foundation module's live now, and the first of the tracks, Inside
Right.
Out Strategy, is due out very soon. Yeah.
Right. The reason I'm pointing to this too is I was just thinking, like, when people are then becoming formal leaders, like managers,
Yeah.
uh, maybe are we lacking some sort of education of the essential pieces? And I see some resonance here, where
Yeah.
of course we can learn all about this finance and operations and what else, but wouldn't it be more helpful to
Yeah.
rely on expertise
Yes.
elsewhere and learn the
Yeah.
essential pieces for this social construct?
Yes. Yes. I mean, like, I have to keep asking that agreements and outcomes question. Agreements and outcomes. It needs to be authentic. Mentioned already. It needs to be in context. I think I've mentioned that already. You need to organize the results of it and all the
Mm,
rest of it.
mm,
There are some skills there. And it's actually very teachable.
mm, mm,
And it's not super hard.
mm,
And some of it you can learn by being exposed to it, watching other people do it. And there is, you can study stuff yourself. Reading the books, a start. But actually, the self-paced training is specifically aimed at leaders, not just practitioners, but
mm,
leaders, people with responsibility in their organisations and a duty of care to the people that work, with them, for them, around them. And there are things they need to pay attention to, things they need to watch for, and things they need to practice. And our training is about, drawing people's attention to those, giving them the opportunity to practice and actually work through some strategy thinking of their own,
mhm,
in their own, for their own context, on their own, doing it as a paper exercise, as great preparation for having these conversations with their colleagues, or having somebody come and do a workshop with them, or whatever, turning them into the most effective participants they can be, or leaders in that process, supporters of that process, sponsors of that process, whatever it might be.
right. There's a final bit I want to touch, which you're up to in
Yeah.
your latest work, which
Yes.
is the deliberately adaptive organization.
Yeah.
And maybe you can give us a little bit of an idea where that leads to, where
Yeah.
that comes from, where
So
we
that
just
goes back to, like, one of the big changes between the first and the second editions of the Agendashift book is that the final chapter, what was called the operation chapter in the first edition, that was definitely the weakest chapter of the whole book. And when I wrote the second edition, I actually didn't even bother to reread what was there. I threw that chapter away and started again. And the new thing was at least twice as big as the new chapter was at least twice as big as the old one. And what I thought would be an appendix to the book, I turned into a whole chapter. So instead of one enormous chapter at the end of the book, it's now two chapters. We are going to the theory of how Agendashift works as a dialogic organization development approach. Words that I'd never even come across dialogic organization development when I wrote the first edition. And then when I got into it and found, well, actually that describes Agendashift amazingly well. So I was really delighted to find, a couple of professors out in Canada, Bush and Marshak, have written the book. Jervis Bush has written some smaller books since, and they resonate really well with Agendashift. And actually, I've been invited to look at contributing another book to that series, which is really, really awesome. But anyway, deliberately adaptive is an integration of all my favorite organizational models, things like viable system models. So going back to some of the great system thinking of around the 60s and 70s, the deliberately developmental organization, which is much more recent and focusing on the psychology of human development and organization development. Things like sociocracy, that's that organizing in circles or looking at your organization edge on in circles. A few key models like that. And taking, the VSM is a very abstract model and people find it very intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
But if you plug in a few things, plug in Agendashift and fill a few gaps with things like sociocracy and deliberately developmental, you get something that's actually quite easy to understand and it's easy to describe in terms that make sense to people that are interested in leadership, interested in organization, perhaps with a background in Agile, but we don't require that. Agendashift's job now isn't to help people do Agile transformations. It's the transformation problem in general, or continuous transformation in general, following a strategy that they develop themselves. And understanding how organizations that are good at that, how they work, it does have some organizational implications. And the deliberately adaptive model is a way of exposing some things that you're definitely going to need that will be, if you don't have them, they are dysfunctions that you might not be aware of yet. But when your organization is under pressure, then you could potentially be in trouble. So it's not a model that you roll out. It's a model that you use to understand and check that things are as healthy as they need to be.
Right. Super, super interesting, and obviously way too short to just talk about and
That's another hour in its own right.
Yeah, exactly. But for the moment that we're coming to an end here, are there any ways where people can get in touch with you, have conversations around this? Are there any conferences coming up maybe around these topics?
I'm very easy to get hold of. So agendashift.com/Mike you will find my main social media presences and things like that. Agendashift has a Slack community. The Academy has a Circle community. That's for people who actually signed up to the Academy, and there's a LinkedIn group as well. So if you're coming at this as a practitioner, not sure yet whether the Academy is for you, then the Slack group in particular, actually, that's where a lot of the conversations happen. A lot of the development of Agendashift actually been very collaborative. There are other people in the Agendashift community that I owe an awful lot to. You could say I'm the curator of this as much as it's curator rather than creator, perhaps. And then the LinkedIn group, it's more a way of just keep making sure you don't miss the key announcements and things like that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. Yeah, agendashift.com/Mike and agendashift.com/Slack.
Awesome. So that sounds like a very fruitful place to go to, or a couple of places to go to for most people, most organizations who deal with change somehow, or an uncertain future where they're about to create something which is a little bit different from what we've tried so far.
Places like Slack and Zoom were very important when like COVID first happened, and the Agendashift Slack was one of the most successful Slack communities in that time, certainly of the communities that I'm a member of. Things are perhaps a bit quieter now, since people have been going back to work, but still it is a successful Slack community, and if people listening to this want to join, then they'll be very welcome.
Right. So that's beautiful. Thanks so much, Mike. What I got from what you just mentioned, I think there's another book to expect over the next months coming from your side.
I'm not going to give a time frame on that.
Sure.
Progress on it is very slow, but I've been given some very nice encouragement as well. So I've got a lot to do, and not short of things to do.
Yeah.
Like everything, you have to allocate your time in the best way you think. I can't be full-time writing much as I would love to be.
But it's I would say important work. It's, I think, impactful, and I think a lot of people could benefit from, whether it's leaders, organizations, anybody who is interested in to make a little bit of a difference. I would recommend, because we had this session here streamed on our Agile Coaching Exchange, to have every coach consider to look into this first of all. Maybe find a few interesting approaches for their day-to-day change work with their clients might make a big difference. The year is still young, so we would love to see a lot of differences this year happening. And obviously also, I'm very curious to see stories from the field. That could be something maybe, because your community is already large enough to bring cases. And yeah, I mentioned a conference. Why not an Agendashift conference?
We had one last year, an online conference. We haven't scheduled the next one yet, but it will definitely happen. We are so focused on getting the academy off the ground at the moment.
Awesome.
That's had its cost in other areas. In terms of case studies and things, I mean, it's one of my big frustrations. We've done some great work. I say we, I mean, talking about partners now, not me personally necessarily, in some of the well-known banks, in some of the well-known top technology companies, in non-profits, all sorts of diverse types of organizations. Too much of that has been NDA'd. You just can't talk about it. And perhaps it's my background working in Swiss banks as well. I don't just throw away clients.
Yeah.
I don't throw clients' names around willy-nilly.
Right.
But that will come. That will come.
And I have to be honest, before it is just a very high level, one of these case studies where you just can't distinguish from a plain advertising sheet, which we also sometimes see with the Agile frameworks. I rather prefer good conversations with people somewhere on a call like this, or at a conference, or
I love doing this
within the community.
Thank you. Yes,
Mike, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Super interesting. Looking forward to see more and learn more about what you're doing, what's coming next. For this, I wish you all the best, a lot of impact, as we can say, with what you're doing. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks for having been here.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And yeah, stay safe and see you soon at any of those platforms, communities, or events which you mentioned. Take care, everyone who was listening. See you soon on another occasion. You've got all the connections. We will put also connections of Mike into the comments of the recorded versions of this stream. And for now, we wish you a good time.